right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I hope you'll also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can find by searching FDRLST. I'm happy to be joined today by one of my favorites, I'm sure your favorites as well, senior political analyst at Fox News Channel, Brit Hume, is with us today. You can follow him on Twitter at Brit Hume. Brit, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Happy to do it, Ben. I'm a fan of the Federalist.
Well, we certainly appreciate your support. I had an odd instance happen this past week, and I have to ask you about it because I'm sure that you have had multiple experiences where an opportunity kind of falls into your lap to do something, and you have to be pretty quick on the uptake to follow on it, which is that I got a call Thursday evening from the White House saying that the president would be happy to have me come and interview him the next morning. And I had put in a request maybe 3 months earlier or something like that to try to get something like that done. But I had to be pretty quick in turning things around. In all your experience, both as White House correspondent and then doing the kind of coverage that you've done at Fox for so many years, how do you deal mentally with having to go in real quick and interview somebody in that kind of circumstance?
Well, I've always thought presidential interviews were very difficult, and I was never all that enthusiastic. Back in my interviewing and anchoring days, it was actually doing an interview with the president. It's a huge opportunity. You're likely to attract a big audience. There's a lot of sort of expectations and pressure, and you have to walk up, kind of what we classically refer to in journalism as a fine line between being persistent and probing and nevertheless being respectful of the president. And I've always thought presidential interviews were very different. And I would think that Trump would be an especially difficult interview because he's all over the place. He says things that are, may not be exactly correct, and you're in the dilemma as to whether to try to pick him up on those things or to correct him or whatever, and you got to be careful doing that. You don't want to get into an argument with him. So I've always found those interviews very difficult, and if I look back on interviews that I thought went well, I don't think any of them was with the president.
Well, there were two things that I kind of tried to do when I was going in, and one is just I have always been bothered by the people who let him, in the course of an interview, engage in these riffs that we've all heard before. Like, I've heard that riff half a dozen times. Why are they letting him do that? Why don't they just interrupt him? And so I interrupted him in 45 minutes, which it ended up being. I interrupted him probably about a dozen times. And each time it was when he would start.
How did that?
Well, he actually, I think it made him more interested because I interrupted him pretty early on and then kept interrupting him. And I think that he actually, I'm not sure I can know him well enough to say he respected it, but he did keep things going. He had given me 20 minutes. He gave me 45.
That's good.
And
good for you. I'm glad you're able to do that.
Well, the thing that sticks out to me, Britt, and maybe I feel like you can have some insight on this, is I don't get, as someone who, started out in the political game, I was a very low level researcher in the White House speechwriting office under W, and then, went into the political speechwriting thing for a bit. I feel like we shouldn't pretend like politicians are kind of speaking from the mountaintop, and if they start to go off into things where, we know what this talking point list is going to be, I feel like it's incumbent on us to kind of interject and say, well, okay, wait, I know that. Here's the actual question. Can you stick to that? Why do you feel like so many journalists today just let people run?
I agree with that in principle strongly. I just think that, you've got an audience out there which was composed of people, many of whom believe that the presidency, if not this, but any particular president, is worthy of a certain level of respect, that there's a limit to how much you can break in and interrupt and challenge a president on the statements he's making. And if you can do that skillfully and in a way that doesn't offend the audience, and therefore make the interview about you instead of about the president,
yeah,
then that's a real accomplishment. It sounds like you did.
Well, I have the I have the luxury of this being an audio and print interview as opposed to on camera. So maybe that's
Right.
just the luxury of it. Um, I know that you are someone who's been paying attention to the track of America's cultural conflicts throughout your career and how much they've changed. To me, it seems like we're in the midst of a cultural civil war that's like nothing that we've seen since the late 60s and early 70s. What do you think about this moment? And do you think that we are in a real cultural civil war or conflict that is going to be enduring and is not just confined to, as many political consultants I think would like to believe, to this particular moment and this particular president?
Well, I think we've been in a cultural conflict for quite a long time, between the urban elites and rural America, and traditional American value, which rural America, where traditional American values are still meaningful and still observed to a great extent. And and I think this latest outbreak is a battle within that conflict. And I must say that I've been thinking about this a lot in recent days about how to analyze this. And I've usually felt, after doing this line of work for more than 50 years, that I can kind of call upon my experience to guide me as to how it's all going to play out. And I'm not at all sure right now that my experience is any guide. I don't know where this is going. I mean, I have been astonished that there has not so far been a bigger backlash against the violence in the streets of these cities. And I've been almost amazed at the extent to which Black Lives Matter has captured the American imagination, and that organization, which is pretty radical in my view, ranks very high in the polls. From what we can tell, I see corporations and institutions doing everything they can to let the world know that they're sympathetic to its goals and support the organization if it isn't really an organization, so support the movement. It's not at all clear to me, Ben, that Black Lives Matter is really concerned with any but a certain type of Black life. That is, Black lives that are taken by police, which are infinitesimally smaller than those that are killed in the streets of urban America as a consequence, among many other things, of gang violence. If Black Lives Matter were deeply preoccupied about all Black lives, you'd think they'd be deeply involved in trying to see what could be done about that. They do not seem to be. They seem to be preoccupied with police violence, which I don't think ranks very high on the list of what's really troubling Black America today.
There was an incident reported in a piece in The Ringer today. It was a long piece about different interactions between community groups and gatherings of cops. And they describe a scenario in Philadelphia where the frustrations of a multi-ethnic group of community organizers and the like associated with BLM sat down with a group of Philadelphia cops and senior management who were entirely Black. And the writer describes the frustration of this group at the inability of these Black cops to understand that they were part of a systemic white supremacist movement. And to me, as someone who has always been or lived around, a number of people who, understood that cops are, often, multi-ethnic police departments, lots of Black cops, in Washington, D.C., a working class job, a working class attitude in a lot of senses. And to see these woke white people yelling at them that they don't understand race in America, it just kind of breaks my brain a little bit. And I don't understand why that cognitive dissonance isn't seen by most Americans.
I don't understand it either, Ben. I think it's because it's so obvious, it's so blatant at a time when not only are police departments, unlike the way they used to be, heavily populated with minority police officers. There are a multitude of African-American police chiefs around the country, including, I might note, in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And the claim that these policemen are the agents of systemic white supremacy seems to me to be just folly. And yet it is accepted as wisdom in quarters where I would not have thought it would have been accepted. And it's astonishing. I mean, the things that are going on. We're now, the civil rights movement in America was a resounding success. And its greatest success, in my view, Ben, was not the passage of laws, the Voting Rights Act and the others, although those were important. What was important was that racism came to be absolutely not acceptable in America. That the nation reached a overwhelming consensus against racism. And the question that arises now is whether movements like Black Lives Matter and others are trying to capitalize on that sentiment, that change in sentiment in America, which is very strong, to usher in a new era with a different agenda. The movement that was once about tearing down barriers now appears to be mostly about tearing down statues, which I don't think will make a particle of difference in the lives of African Americans in this country.
Yeah, I don't think that justice for George Floyd is served by tearing down the statue of Frank Rizzo. But it's one of these situations.
Well, it's not only that. Think about that for a second, Ben. I mean, look, George Floyd was unquestionably a victim of police violence. Of course he was. But is he a hero? Is he truly a martyr to a cause? I think there's reason to doubt that. Mm-hmm. And the attention given to his death and to him as an individual in the aftermath of it is really quite striking. I mean, there are presidents who didn't have funeral ceremonies to rival his. Remarkable.
Well, I think part of that is that, it's a combination of factors. It's that the incident with him was so egregious, such an obvious depiction of police brutality, and that it followed a number of other incidents that had been ramping up racial tension in the previous months, including the shooting in Georgia, including a number of other incidents of racism, even the incident with the white woman and the black bird watcher in New York. Everything seemed to be building to that, and then people having been locked down for as long as they were, they wanted a reason to get out. And I feel like on a certain level, there was some familiarity with this that people found comforting. Like, finally, we can be angry at something, or angry at some group of people, in this case, cops, and we can take out, to the streets and protest against them, and feel like we have some agency, that we're doing something, as opposed to sitting in our homes or in our apartments going stir crazy, and not having anywhere to direct that animosity because of an invisible foe in this virus.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, Ben, because I've thought that the frustration and impatience that was occasioned by these lockdowns, which I happen to consider to be perhaps the worst public policy decisions of my lifetime, mm-hmm. Were a major contributing factor to the mood in America. Not to mention the fact that, of course, that people were not going to their offices, students were not, going to classes, schools were closed, streets were wide open. If you're trying to, it's almost a perfect storm for street protests, violence, and rioting, mm-hmm. which is what we got.
There's a real reluctance on the part of most Republicans in Washington, and I think most Republicans across the country, to take firm stands against this violence and rioting, to say that peaceful protest is, of course, a constitutional right, but that engaging in this kind of looting and violence is unacceptable. After 4 years plus of seeing what success President Trump found as both a candidate and in terms of solidifying his support so well among Republican voters, why is it that still Republican politicians have this attitude where they're afraid of being called racist or politically incorrect, or engaging in any kind of speech that might run afoul of what many in the media would use against them in instances like this, when it seems like, if anything, the president has proven that kind of leaning into these culture war issues is better for you than leaning away from them?
Well, I'm not sure for that, and I've been waiting for it to happen. I'm waiting for some Republican leaders to stand up and say, "Enough of this. This is a fraud. That this isn't really about improving the lives of Black Americans and taking their participation in American society to the next level." And then they will say it in a quiet way. And I'm not sure, Ben, that Donald Trump has been all that successful in this.
No, I don't think he has. I just think that he's shown that in terms of gaining your own Republican support, I would argue that you are not helped in any way by kind of veering away from this, and it's better to engage, I guess, than not engage. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Well, I suppose that's right. And of course, the politicians are reading the polls, and when you look at the polls and find that Black Lives Matter is enjoying distinct majority support in this country, you're not exactly tempted to go out and take them on. Someone needs to, because I think in some respects you could argue it's a scam, but it's a very radical movement, and mainstream sentiment is swung behind it for reasons that I find quite hard to grasp. The other problem the president has, of course, is in taking on this street violence, which has been where there's been a near abdication of responsibility by mayors and governors around the country. His effect on local law enforcement, which is what we're talking about here, is minimal. Yeah. This is the federal government, and he can talk about sending in the troops or calling out the National Guard, but that's only a response for governors and other local officials, and he can't do a lot much about it. So he can talk about it, and I think people to some extent have become inured to his talk. And of course, he manages constantly to overstate the case, which is something that he's chronically inclined to do.
Mm-hmm. Whatever the actual poll numbers are, it's clear that the president is behind. I think he thinks he's behind. Question is just by how much and where he's the most behind. This is obviously an extremely odd election. It really doesn't feel like it's started even yet, because we basically had a nomination decided, and then everything shut down, and we haven't really had a campaign to speak of. In terms of the challenges that are facing him, do you think this is a scenario where Joe Biden really can win the presidency by basically just saying nothing all the way until November?
Well, it's working well so far, isn't it?
Yeah.
It means that Trump is the issue, and if you were advising Biden, if I were advising Biden, and that's not my line of work, but I've watched a lot of campaigns for over the long years, I would think that making Donald Trump the issue is the right play, and not doing or saying much is having that effect or helping to have that effect. And of course, Trump is indisposed to not make himself the issue. He wants to be, front and center at all times. He loves it. He loves the spotlight. And so he plays right into Biden's hands by doing that. And look, I've known Biden forever. There's no question in my mind that he's senile. I experienced some of the same memory issues I see with him. I think in his case, they're more acute, but I don't think the symptoms are undeniable. He's an old man with the symptoms of being an old man. And sometimes he seems utterly feeble. He rouses himself on occasions, as he did in his last televised debate with Bernie Sanders. He was pretty sharp that night, but much of the rest of the time he seems out of it. And people look at that, if they were focused on that a lot and intently, they might say, geez, we can't elect this guy president. My own personal view is that it's not as worrisome as it might seem, but nonetheless, there it is. And his staying out of sight is helping. Now, at some point, if he's going to do 3 debates, we're going to get a very large dose of it. And it's worth noting, I think, that the Trump administration, the Trump campaign wants 4 debates. Asking for more debates is not the behavior of a candidate who's ahead.
Yeah. There are 2 things about that Biden aspect. One is, and you and I think, have both had experiences with Biden, maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is different from just big fish story Biden, which I think we're all familiar with. And it's kind of, just a guy with the gift for gab and someone who can come up with some entertaining anecdotes. This is someone who I think clearly has some more serious problems than that. But I wonder about two aspects of that. One is, do you think that the media can do what it seems to think its job is and just carry him over the finish line? I keep seeing this word being used about him in writings and on various TV networks where they refer to him as reliable, which is just designed to kind of put that idea in your head. And then the other is, do you think that the campaign is in any way trying to lower expectations by what they put out? For instance, I notice, I don't know how much YouTube you watch, but they have an ad that's been running for about a month from Biden that pops up in front of a lot of different videos that I see on YouTube. And in it, he fumbles a word, like at the very first sentence of the ad. And so my takeaway is either the campaign is kind of dumb and missed this, or they're trying to lower my expectations. So the next time I see him and it's like, oh, he was surprisingly coherent, then I feel pretty good about it.
Well, my feeling about that is that I can understand why you might think, I think I may be a little too clever, but normally you want to present your candidate in the best light.
Yeah.
And you don't want to do advertisements that don't do that. That may have been the only take they got.
That's what I'm thinking.
Everything else was probably worse because he does fumble around a lot and doesn't know exactly where he is and can't remember stuff and all that. And I think that's real. I would say this about it. Biden has always been prone to gaffes and to brag, much as Trump does, about this and that, and to overstate his involvement in certain legislation and so on. That's always been true of Biden. And he says impolitic things and always has. They're of a certain character. And he still makes those gaffes. But a lot of what we see now is clearly the result of a diminished capacity. And, how big an issue that is now, and of course, Trump running around saying, he can't finish a sentence and so forth. He's got to be careful because Biden can pull himself together as he proved in that debate with Bernie. And if he can do it in the debates, I don't see how he gets beaten.
Yeah. I certainly think that that's a possibility in terms of what we're looking at. Trump, in the interview that I did with him the other day, said that he viewed Biden as a Trojan horse for the left, and that he expected the Senate to, on day one, use the nuclear option, push through a bunch of radical left legislation. To what extent do you think it's possible to even make that argument? Is it too complicated to make to Americans to basically say, you think this is an election that pits Joe Biden, the more centrist, moderate reputation, versus Donald Trump, but in reality, it's Biden as a vehicle for a lot of these far more radical things in terms of his positions, even on paper, than he's ever taken. I mean, you think of something like, this is the first time he's ever run for office on getting rid of the Hyde Amendment. It's going to be the first time he's ever run for office where he's probably going to be endorsed by zero police unions in any kind. This is
that's all out there, and I think it's real. I would say this: Biden has already embraced a number of positions far more radical than he ever used to support. So, if you're going to make the case about that, you don't even have to rely on what these, the people behind the throne are going to push through with his acquiescence. You can cite the things that he's, the positions he used to take and doesn't anymore, and so on, the way he's flip-flop on various things. And there's plenty of that out there. So he will run to the left of Barack Obama based on positions he's already taken. So and he, of course, he wants to undo the tax cuts. He wants the regulatory apparatus will be reactivated and so forth. So that's all out there. But the problem, of course, is his great advantage is that he's not Trump.
Yeah.
And look, possible, Ben, that I think Trump underpolls. I think we learned that in 2016, that you don't get a clear picture from the polling of where he stands. And of course, some of those state polls were well off. whether that'll be true this time, I don't know. You can't rule it out. I'm surprised at the level of confidence I see in certain Trump supporters. You know, when I posted something on Twitter or said it elsewhere and gotten a response to the effect that Trump is behind nationally, and he's behind in state after state after state that he needs to win. And people say, "You believe that? Come on, you know the polls are fake." I don't think the polls are fake. I think it's possible he underpolls and maybe doing better than we think, and that the battleground state situation is tighter than we realize. And of course, races tighten toward the end. But right now, he's behind. And Biden's non-engagement strategy seems to be working, which is interesting. And it ought to be a lesson to Trump that Trump is the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, usually you couldn't beat something with nothing. Biden's betting, in a sense, that in terms of what the campaign consists of, that you can.
Do you recall Michael Kelly's, the late great Michael Kelly's column about the Clinton foreign policy team suggesting that it ought to be replaced with a ham and cheese sandwich? Because I think that this is a situation where we are finally getting to see basically a ham and cheese sandwich candidacy, at least in the way that it's being presented on Biden's part.
Yeah, and it doesn't even look like they're going to have much of a convention, even, which is normally, you know, that's normally the moment when you dress up your candidate in his most endearing costume and pull him out on the stage and let him do his carefully prepared stuff with all kinds of carefully prepared stuff to support him or her, as it was in the case of Hillary Clinton, and that's a big vehicle. The Democrats don't seem much interested in doing that. Of course, they want to be correct on COVID, so they got to be careful about that. Trump, on the other hand, seems to want to have a big worship session of the kind that he's accustomed to. How well all that'll play in the middle of this pandemic is anybody's guess at this point, but I have my doubts that it'll play well for Trump.
We rarely see vice presidential picks matter in any sense except a negative. Do you think that there is a big mistake that Biden could make when it comes to his VP pick, or a big win? Or do you think that it's roughly a wash, just given the realistic candidates for the job right now?
Well, I think he's hemmed himself in, and he's got to choose a woman. He's made that's abundantly clear. If he didn't do that, that would be trouble for him. And in the current atmosphere, he may feel at least is obliged to pick a black woman. Mm-hmm. And you know, that may be a big plus for him, and it may unite them. Normally, you know, one of the things you try to do with your vice presidential pick is to unite your party by picking somebody who appeals to whatever wing of the party you don't come from. And so, you know, Biden picking Kamala Harris, for example, or someone of that stripe might achieve that. And of course, the united party is a huge advantage in any presidential campaign.
I do wonder whether this is one of those years where he has to stick to that script, just because picking anybody who could be viewed as potentially screwing things up, trying to introduce somebody new to the American people, could be a risk. At the same time, though, you know, the attention, I think, is going to be a lot harder on this person, because unlike, you know, previous presidential elections, the assumption is going to be this person's going to play an outsized role in whatever presidency he ends up having.
Might become president early on.
Yeah. And that carries a lot more weight with it.
Yeah, I guess that's right. I think that's a correct assessment.
The thing that is the thing that's bothering me, I guess, about a lot of this is how outsized the dominance has been of the baby boomer generation in our politics. I like to bring up on, with regularity, that it's just so weird that we have 3 presidents who were all born in the same year, within just a few months of each other, in Clinton W and Trump, all born in 1946. It seems very odd to have a situation as a country where that would be such a skewed element of our politics for so long. Do you think that this is going to be the last? And keep in mind, you know, Biden isn't technically even a boomer. He's silent generation.
No, he's the same age I am. He was born in 1943, I believe. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm 77. He's 77. and yeah, he's pre-boomer, isn't he?
Yeah.
And of course, it's interesting that when America is supposed to be the youth is supposed to be dominant now, that we got these two old guys, running for president against each other at a time you thought somebody younger might have come along and captured the public's imagination and gotten the nomination.
Why do you think that has not been the case?
Well, I think this: if you're a successful American, educated, qualified, smart, interested in public policy, and attracted possibly to politics because you think you can make a difference, or because you think it's the highest form of service, or your highest ambition would be to be a successful politician. You look at what you have to live through and the atmosphere you have to operate in to do that. It's not attractive. I mean, our politics is so poisonous now. The media atmosphere is so pitiless that I think a great many people who might be attracted to politics are not. That they think this is a hell of a life. I don't want my children growing up in this atmosphere. I don't want to have to be out fundraising all the time. It's not a nice life. And so I think a lot of people are turned away from it, including younger people. This is a poisonous situation in this country. Mm-hmm. We need to start thinking about what we in the media need to do to change this. It's bad.
The media has gone through a lot of changes during your career. It is right now engaged in a pretty significant struggle session over race that seems to be playing out every week in hiring decisions, in authority decisions, in benefit decisions, and the like. People kind of at each other's throats at the New York Times and at the Washington Post in some pretty shocking ways. Do you think this is a situation where the media's inability to have enough balance in their newsrooms in terms of background or perspective on a host of different issues, not even saying political bias, but just the bias of how people live or where they came from, has that led us to this point where it's just the people talk about silos and things like that, but to me, there are a few areas more siloed than a lot of these newsrooms that are engaged in.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
This back and forth.
I couldn't agree more. They are monolithic almost in their ideology, and you're seeing that play out in this this mutiny at the New York Times over an editorial column from a sitting United States senator representing a viewpoint held by, at that moment at least, a distinct majority of the American public, and they ended up firing the editorial page editor. I mean, that was an atrocity that never could have happened in the New York Times of old. Abe Rosenthal famously used to say, in fact, he said it to me once in an interview I had with him, that he wanted to be remembered as having kept the paper straight, was his phrase. It's on his gravestone. Well, now we know, in a sense, what he was worried about. It has come to pass. The New York Times is no longer a straight newspaper. It's a very, very biased newspaper. And the old discipline of neutrality in news coverage, which used to be an absolute standard, unquestioned, universally adhered to, is out the window. And there's an atmosphere in the news business today that Donald Trump constitutes a national emergency, requiring a new breed of journalist and journalism, in which the old idea of being neutral about everything and engaging in what is now derisively referred to as, quote, both sidesism should be abolished. Well, what I would say to you right now, Ben, and I suspect you agree, is we don't have enough both sidesism. We're getting to the point where certain viewpoints are considered taboo and should not be expressed or adhered to or even written about on the editorial pages. So that's where we are. It's a very bad thing. The public senses it, and that has contributed mightily, in my view, to the low esteem in which our trade is now held.
One of the elements that I find so irritating about this is the use of the word violence in reference to either words or non-words. The phrase that I've heard, of course, is silence is violence, meaning if you don't stand up in some way, demonstrating allyship that is an act of violence or siding with racist people. And that in the context of the editorial you were mentioning, one of the big things that people started saying right away was this puts the lives of Black employees at the New York Times at risk of violence. That was something that people were tweeting and retweeting and sharing. And, to me,
that's right, Ben. Yeah, you have to believe that. You have to believe that if you're a New York Times reporter, an African-American New York Times reporter out covering the violence in the streets or the protests or whatever they are at a given moment, that some looter or thug or person intent on violence would be upset about the fact that your paper published an editorial they don't agree with, and they would come after you for that. What nonsense. It's far-fetched. It's absurd.
I just can't even, this is the same New York Times that published the Taliban, published Vladimir Putin, published Erdogan. It's like Tom Cotton's opinion is going to be the thing that tips the scale. It just doesn't make any rational sense.
No, of course it doesn't. And the fact that it could be expressed and not laughed out of the conversation is a testament to where we are. Mm-hmm. People are cowering in the face of all this.
Well, and I will say that it's not just the
politicians. The New York Times are among them.
Mm-hmm. It's not just the politicians who are cowering, though. I hear from a lot of people across the country who read the Federalist and write into us every day and say, things along the lines of, thank you so much for what you're doing. I'm legitimately worried about losing my job if I don't go along with all these different things. I'm being assigned to read White Fragility, which is one of the, just try to read it, Brit. It will, your hair will light on fire. And not because of the bad ideas, because of the bad writing before you even get to the bad ideas. But it's one of these situations where people who are normal Americans, who have a flag on the front of their house, don't view that as a political expression. I think that might end up becoming kind of a symbol in the coming weeks and months, that they feel under pressure from all of these, for them, new ideas about their participation in systemic racism and white supremacy simply by actions that they never viewed as being problematic and that historically have not been, or things of that nature. What do you say, what do you try to say to people who come to you, and I'm sure you have friends like this, who don't work in the media industry, who basically say, look, I appreciate you standing up, but if I stand up, I could lose my job?
Well, it's a very real threat. And I'm very sympathetic to people. This atmosphere has got to change. And people in authority and with standing need to speak up and stand up and say what needs to be said, because, I think, people in this country, sensible people who have reason to be afraid, are looking for a leader. And we don't have that leader right now. I mean, we who express our analysis and opinion, have our adherents, but there's nobody in the political realm who has emerged as a leader on this, and someone needs to. It is a mantle out there waiting to be claimed. And Trump, although you would think with the size of his megaphone that he might be in a position to claim it, has really not done so. He says things that are kind of on the right track, but he doesn't really make the full case for the free and open society that we were in. He doesn't make the case for the level of progress we've made in America. No nation on earth that I'm aware of has made a stronger effort to bring its minority populations into its mainstream. We've been at it for years. It's a unanimous public sentiment. Great changes have been made. Police reform, which you're now talking about, as if there'd never been any police reform. It's just one area where we've done enormous things. Police departments are very different from the way they used to be. You would never know of any of that from what you're seeing and reading and hearing. Someone needs to speak up for this. Someone with a voice and a megaphone. It hasn't happened.
It was one of the great ironies to me of seeing that Christopher Columbus statue come down in Minneapolis, because as you know, Brit, if you see a Christopher Columbus statue that looks like it was built in the late 20s or the early 30s, it was the kind of thing that usually got protested by the Klan, because it was an indication
Right.
of Italian Americans being fully accepted as fully American, and an affirmation of them, built and sculpted by them. And, as the one in Minneapolis was, of course, including by a guy who helped build Grand Central Station in New York. And it's one of these things where, look, I understand people have not gotten great educations, but this is an ancient history. This is 100 years ago, and it's one of these things that I guess I just kind of thought that people knew these things about this country, and I learned that they don't.
I got the headmaster of the secondary school, which I went to in Washington, very fine school with enormous reputation. That was a long time ago when I was there. I couldn't have got, if I came along now, I'd never get in, but I did, and I got out barely. And I got the headmaster sent I guess he's called a head of school now or something equally anodyne, sent out a letter to the alumni on this issue of, the protests and race in America and where we stand in systemic racism. It was a nauseating pile of utter twaddle of a kind that just made me weep for the absurdity and silliness and shallowness of it, and the conformity of it, and the correctness of it. And I think, if we're looking for, one of the problems we're facing, it's the claptrap that kids are being taught in schools and colleges nowadays. And it's, the 1619 Project, which is a fraud, historically a fraud, and has been so denounced by leading historians of the period,
including Gordon Wood, who's no right winger.
Exactly, and when that kind of stuff is being picked up and adapted into college studies, you got a problem, and we do.
Yeah, I'm really worried about that, and I hear from a lot of parents who are worried about that. I had a call just the other day, a couple who live in Texas, who are friends of mine. They have their boys are 5 and 7, and they're worried that they're going to have to take their kids and put them in a different, in a private school or something, because they're worried about this stuff just infecting the whole of their teaching. And that stuff has ramifications. And I feel like there was a period there where a lot of right of center journalists were talking about craziness on campus, and it was all just kind of a joke to the people who were reporting about it. And oh, look at these nutty students and stuff. Well, those students are running HR departments now. They're running comms departments. They're working in corporations, and that gives them power.
Yes, they are. It does. And the stuff one of the things that's troublesome, of course, is that a lot of this stuff that is accepted is sort of presented without argument, so that it's never challenged in a meaningful way, so that people just absorb this claptrap, and these things become words to live by. And there's never any the fact that nobody wants any both sidesism means they don't get any. So there you go.
I know that there's some DC based Republicans who are of the opinion, in my view, an illusion, that if Trump loses in November, as the polls indicate he's likely to, that this will all die down and go away. And that basically he's just fomented this culture war, and that's the only reason why these things are happening. And as soon as he's gone, then all the temperature will go down, and we can go back to arguing about capital gains tax cuts and that type of thing. I think that's fanciful.
I do too. Trump's election was a symptom of something. It's not a cause of much.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's so exotic and divisive is a contributing factor now to the atmosphere. But the roots of this predate him by quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. You've been generous with your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I did want to bring up, I know I brought it up to you before, your one of my favorite clips from the animated Seth MacFarlane show, American Dad, features you. Do you remember this?
No.
So the main character in it, Stan Smith, is a CIA guy who's very Republican, and he's complaining in a very early episode that their new neighbors are members of the liberal media. And his wife says to him, well, Stan, you don't hate all members of the liberal media. I know you like Brit Hume. And he slams his fist down on the table and he says, you know damn well I love Brit Hume. So
I'm glad somebody does.
I know that people do love your analysis and appreciate it under the perspective that you bring. Can you give us a little bit of perspective on this moment that adds on a little bit of knowledge? Because so many of the people I talk to who are in their late 20s and early 30s just feel like, this is just the worst. This is the worst time. This is just terrible. It's so awful. And then on the flip side, I read these books about the late 60s and 70s, and it seems like maybe we should have a little perspective on that yes, things are very fractious, but in a sense they could be a lot worse in a lot of ways.
Well, the difference between this time, I think, in the late 60s is that there is in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a single proximate cause of the unrest. Yes, there was a big racial component, and that was addressed, and it was on the way to being addressed when all hell broke loose in 1968. The Vietnam War was a triggering event, and things really did calm down after it was ended. And our politics have been, were relatively calm for a period of time. I think the never-ending, the ceaseless and relentless efforts of the American left to infiltrate and ultimately control major institutions in this country, the media and the academy being chief among them, has borne over a long period of time real fruit. Mm-hmm. And its influence is present in what students are learning and have been learning for some time in colleges and even in less advanced schooling than that. And they are now dominant in the Democratic Party to an extent they never were before. And the rest of the country is simply not on board with that. And so we have this tremendous level of division of a kind we've never experienced before in our politics. The country is as bitterly divided over a variety of issues as it has ever been, if not more so. And this year has been nearly as tumultuous as 1968. And you think about the events that fed into this, Ben. You got this controversial and extremely polarizing presidency. On top of that, have the coronavirus, and news is happening at a speed. News cycles are going by at a speed we've never seen before. I mean, here it is July, and it's almost impossible to remember that we impeached this president earlier this year, an event that in past times would have stood at the forefront of our memory throughout this election season. It's off the table, and nobody's even talking about it. Nobody seems to care about it. I mean, Nancy Pelosi said afterwards he'll always be impeached. Well, that may be true, but nobody cares. So we're living in a very unique time, and I think the divisions are deeper than I've seen, and I'm not sure how they're going to heal or who can heal them. I think it's all up in the air.
Well, I think it's incumbent upon us to be the solution that maybe our leaders won't be in this instance, and I hope that we can. Brit,
I do too.
Brit, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it was my pleasure too, Ben. Thank you very much.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.